Welcome to Press Coverage. I am Theo Gremminger, and at Press Coverage, we're looking to find you the edges that you need to win in fantasy football. And I'm looking to bring on the sharpest guest possible. And today, repeat guest. You guys all enjoyed the last episode I dropped with Nelson Sousa, maybe about a month ago, 6 weeks ago. This time of year, Nelson, it's like it feels kind of like yesterday. But last time Nelson was on, we talked about some targets and some fades. Nelson is very well known for writing his fades list over at FTN. You can check his work out there. Nelson, welcome into Press Coverage. We're almost at August 1st. We're almost in like serious season with the big high stakes drafts.
Yeah, absolutely. I just got I got a late start to the season. I think last time when we talked, I had mentioned that I was going to start a little later than usual, but I've been going. So, from this point forward now, it's go time and trying to draft pretty much every night.
Yeah, I'm not there yet. I'm gonna be in a couple more of these slow drafts, and I think once we get to like August 1st, I'm gonna be able to start mixing in, a number of these 350s. I talked to Dan Williamson. I talked to yourself. I'm trying to schedule out like the high stakes drafts that I'm doing for NFFC, FFPC. I mean, we're talking about the New York City draft. Nelson and I split team in the New York Super. That's going to be a very, very exciting. That's a really, really hard draft. A lot of the better players on the East Coast are going to be in that one. And then I go to Vegas the following week, and I'll draft NFFC, FFPC. So we're really right around the corner. It's sort of like a wake-up call once you get past July 4th, and now we're almost at August 1. So, Nelson, when you talk about drafting every night, you're doing a number of these 350 drafts. I'll say this is a great way to kind of segue into our first question is where do you find yourself in terms of what draft strategy have you been following for the most of the time this year? And I'll say this, like anytime I talk to a great drafter like Nelson, he's probably open to multiple strategies, but it's sort of like you'll look back on like 5-6 drafts and say, oh, I did maybe a few more hero RB builds than I thought, or maybe a few more RB, maybe a few more zero RB teams. What has been the majority of your early starts?
Yeah, so it's interesting because that's what I've been analyzing this week is just looking at draft boards and looking at my teams and seeing how I like to build teams this year. And I do try to treat every year as its own, it's a different year. What worked last year for me might not necessarily work this year. Player ADPs change, different, players come on the scene at running back or wide receiver. And, I think you can't sit there and get stuck on just one particular type of build. You got to stay open-minded. But I will say this. So looking back at I did this research and I always do it every year. Looking back last year, my top 5 successful teams, and I looked at my bottom 5 successful teams, okay? The bottom 5 teams that were just, my bad team, okay? There was no particular build necessarily that stuck out to me. It just came down to just picking bad players.
There you go.
Like that's why the team sucked. Like there was no like, zero running back or, all these teams were heavy running back. There was none of that. It was kind of scattered, right? But my top 5 teams, including one that finished 3rd overall in the main event, one that finished 13th overall, and then 2 finished 27th and 28th overall. And this is out of I don't know, 8. How many teams were in the main event last year? Like 2,000
for the prime time, right?
Yeah, for the prime time.
Yeah, I think they're definitely north of 1,800. Probably you're probably correct. Like somewhere in that near 2,000 range. I'd be interested to see the final number.
Yeah,
anyway, you cut it. You ran pure. You got 4 out of the top 30.
4 out of the top 30, and my 5th team was like 57th overall. Okay, so top of the top, as far as in terms of success, right? when looking at those teams and how I built those teams, 4 out of the 5 teams were okay. How do I put this? 3 of them started 3 wide, 1 started 4 wide, and the 5th team was 1 running back, 1 quarterback in the first 5 rounds with 3 wide receivers. So what stuck out to me in terms of team construction and builds, it's pretty obvious to me that I have a preference, and it's usually to go wide receiver heavy, or I guess you would call it hero running back. So like an example is I like taking McCaffrey, Bijan, or Breece Hall, and then just going 3-4 wide from there, or going wide receiver heavy and trying to figure out which running backs are going to just severely outproduce their ADP and hopefully hitting on those guys. But like my top team that finished 3rd overall in the prime time was basically a 4 wide team. It was 4 wide receivers, and I hit on the running backs later in the draft.
Yeah, and I think that you nailed it. Like last year was a year where a sharp guy like yourself, we had so much running back success from like the traditional dead zone backs, where CMC finished as RB1 overall, but then Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, Rachaad White, Raheem Mostert, Joe Mixon, those guys were the next running backs in terms of running back scoring in PPR, and all of those guys were dead zone backs except for Raheem Mostert, who was the guy we were getting in like round 10, round 11, later early in the summer, but it adjusted when we got to like the real money weeks towards, Labor Day weekend. So I think the one thing you nailed is draft good players is the most important thing. Anytime if I have Nelson Sousa or Chris Vaccaro or Chad Schroeder or Dan Williamson or any very highly successful high stakes player, they're going to tell you that they're not dogmatic with a single approach. So like myself, I'll draft a 0 RB team. I have no problem going 4 straight wideouts, but if the situation presents itself, I'm okay with a 2 running back start. I've sort of done it different ways. And I think you just need to be flexible when you enter these drafts and not dead set in a particular strategy, because it does change year to year with the hit rates. I remember a few years ago where all of the major contests had a hero RB team sort of taking it down. We've had other years where I know in other particular years it might be a 0 RB team. I know that year Tommy Libretti took down I believe it was the Silver Bullet and the Classic the same year. He did pure 0 RB. So the different starts to me are less important than the players. You just have to be structurally sound and know, like, once you're in a particular build, where you have to recover. You brought up where, like, hitting those running backs. And today, Nelson and I are going to take a big focus on rounds 3 through 10. Rounds 3 through 10 have been very important rounds for finding league winners. And we're going to cite some of the previous years a little later on in the show. Nelson, you just dropped a really awesome article, and I know you're going to reveal one of these guys when we talk about our league winners, but let everybody know about the running back article you just dropped over at FTN.
Yeah, so I just dropped this year's Rachaad White, and the point of the article is to try to find that running back that's going in the middle rounds, somewhere around, anywhere from round 4 through 8. And it's basically trying to find that one guy that obviously, they're going in that range, but they perform as like a top 5 running back. And I started it last year with this year's Josh Jacobs, right? Because we were coming off that year where Jacobs was basically like, he was an afterthought. No one was really, he was definitely not getting pushed up. It was just kind of like, okay, he's here. I'm going to settle for him. And he was going like 7th round, I want to say 2 years ago. And he was a difference maker for everyone. Anyone that got him in the 7th round and put the rest of the team together, they were tough to beat. And last year, I did this year's Josh Jacobs, and I named 3 running backs that I felt that fit the profile of what I was looking for in terms of that breakout running back, right? Obviously, the ADP has to fit, but I had hit on Rashad White because he was one of the guys that I named that I felt had that opportunity. And obviously, this past year he finished as a top 5, running back in fantasy PPR. And this year I did the same thing. So I'm hoping that, it becomes popular. And not just popular, I hope it becomes popular for the fact that I keep hitting on that guy, right? So I again named 3 guys that I felt fit the profile, and we'll see if it ends up working out.
Yeah, it's always a great read. You drop a couple of articles every summer that are sort of appointment reading. I know that the fades list is always one that people really look forward to, and I know you're going to update that one throughout the summer. Let's kind of flip this over. This time of year, we start to get like real information because we have training camp. How do you filter out what's important to you in terms of like beat reporters, in terms of maybe coach speak? Are you looking for vibes where it's positivity, maybe from multiple platforms, or do you try to ignore a lot of it? Like, where are you at in terms of the information coming in? Because it's constant now. It's certainly, you get a lot more information now than you did 10 years ago, and exponentially more than like 15 years ago. Where are you at with trying to filter out the noise and use it as a tool?
That's a difficult question to answer, because I feel like I don't have really a right or wrong answer for that, because I feel like a lot of it I filter through it and just don't get I don't get overly opinionated on like beat writers posting a 12-second video of a wide receiver making a toe tap catch, on the sidelines, looked great or whatever, or he makes a one-handed catch in the end zone over, a corner, not in pads. I look at that stuff and I'm like, you're an effing professional football player, okay, in the NFL. You're supposed to do that. Like that's who you are. So I don't really get too crazy with that kind of stuff. So I try to remain level-headed, and that's probably the advice that I can give people, is to don't get worked up over like the highlight catches and things like that. It really, at the end of the day, it doesn't mean nothing. That's what they're supposed to do in non-padded practices.
Yeah, I've been accused of being a hype guy, and I do enjoy. I tell you what,
you're a hype guy.
I do. I love a highlight. I love a highlight catch. I'm not going to lie. When you've been starving all summer for actual football, and then you see a player that you're into make a big play, I'm not going to lie. I love it, and I love to try to follow as much as possible. And I think for me, I agree with you fundamentally. If I thought that a guy was I was fading, I'm not going to necessarily be into him because some beat reporter tells me, one little clip that was positive. And what's interesting is I had Billy and I have had the Coach Speak Index on First Class Fantasy, and I've also had 32 beat reporters on Press Coverage. Highly recommend that one. He talks about sort of some teams have beat reporters that have been doing this a long time, maybe a little more credible. Some other teams might have beat reporters that, much like fantasy football content creators, are trying to get people to see their work. So you got to be able to kind of see the noise. But one thing that I do like, Nelson, is when sort of everything converges. When you have positivity coming from teammates, maybe talking up a young player performing, maybe you have the coaching staff, and then you have the beat reporters all reporting on one thing, whether it's negative, whether it's positive. that's something I really do like to listen to. And then I think sometimes when people in high places throw somebody under the bus, you really want to pay attention to it. Like today, Dennis Allen comes out and crushes Kendre Miller. It says something about the guy can't stay healthy, not in a very nice way. That's something we want to pay attention to as well. So I think it's a lot of it for me is vibes from multiple angles. I think if we remember the big Michael Thomas year where Sean Payton was saying, draft Michael Thomas, the Saints beat reporters were saying, Michael Thomas is awesome. Michael Thomas ends up being a wide receiver 1 as a rookie. I think sometimes we want to pay attention to it when it's from all angles.
Now, I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, but I'm going to bring up because this one was really it made a difference in fantasy. Was the Jamar Chase can't catch the football?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
The drops.
So, yeah, all those drops, right? Can't catch the football. He's struggling, right? And that dropped him in fantasy drafts, and he went on to have a great year. So that's, I think it works both ways. So even sometimes negative talk, you can't get too down on a player. And I'll give you another example. What was in fact Josh Jacobs, right? So it was. I don't think it was necessarily McDaniels shitting on him, but it was the fact that McDaniels was talking about. I think it was Abdullah that was there, right?
It was that, and then the thing that freaked people out even more was they put him out there in the. So this is like we have to like adjust based on what happens every year. It used to be that no legitimate player would ever go out in the first preseason game, and certainly not in the Hall of Fame game. And Josh Jacobs went out and played significant time in the Hall of Fame game. So people were like, oh my God, Josh Jacobs is over. Let's draft Zamir White. And then Jacobs ends up being not only an ADP winner, but finishes as like a top 3 running back, was a league winner. So yeah, I'm totally with you.
And the narrative was McDaniels brought over Brandon Bolden, right? So it was kind of like, the Patriots coaching tree. He's a running back by committee guy, right? That's what they do. So Jacobs just basically like plummeted, right? No one believed in him. They figured, I mean, there was even maybe like talk of possibly getting cut. I think like there was a little bit of it. And then he goes into the season and literally does not come off the field. So I'm just saying, like, you really, really have to be careful with negative and positive news on players. You really have to stay grounded when it comes to that stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting where the numbers don't necessarily back it up, because the true amount of drafts that happen when we get to, like, let's say August 20th on, there's so many drafts between August 20th and the start of the NFL season. But there's an argument to be made that there is a number of drafters guys we respect out there that know how to draft, that would be better drafters on August 1st than they would 2 days before the season. Because again, it's the constant information. You start changing your views on guys. You start adjusting things that maybe you've been locked in on for 6 weeks, and then one thing happens and you make big adjustments. So I'm with you, Nelson. We want to take everything with a grain of salt. It's wonderful that we have that information, but we don't want to let it be too much of an influencer either way. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, Nelson and I are going to talk about league winners. We're going to specifically look at players from rounds 3 through 10 that we think could crush their ADP and help you win this season in fantasy. We'll be right back.
Hey, it's the Podfather of great news. The Draft Kit is live. It is world famous. Why? Because it is the best resource for winning fantasy football championships that exists. There are rankings and cheat sheets for every format you can imagine. We have projections both at the team level and the player level. And wherever you are, you can click on a player, open them up, and see in-depth written analysis about what to expect in fantasy football from that player this year. And then you can click on the team and you can get even more in-depth analysis, all the drivers of fantasy production, both in a positive and negative direction for that team, including a signature trend. And the graphics are incredible. So these team insights, they give you the team level projections, the vacated targets, the vacated air yards. And we added a bunch of features. I mean, individual cheat sheets for Theo and Billy and Dario. So you could take your favorite analyst and download their personal draft cheat sheet. And then in the commissioners section, Memphis Young lays out everything you need to know to manage a league. The best minds in the industry contributing analysis. It's certainly not the most inexpensive draft kit on the market, but it is the best. Playerprofiler.com/draft kit. Playerprofiler.com/draft kit. Go get it.
Welcome back to Press Coverage. Theo Gremminger with Nelson Sousa of FTN. Nelson, before we get into some of these players, I want to quickly react to a little bit of news. Chase Brown is a guy that we spoke about positively last time we were recording together. That's been a guy where you said, I have him ahead of Zach Moss. And I know there's a lot of players that we talked to in the high-stakes streets that have sort of been on that train for a while. It looks like their ADPs are about to converge. So are we still into selecting Chase Brown? Let's say he moves up positionally to where Zach Moss is. Is there sort of a cutoff point for you where he goes from a guy you're comfortable drafting to maybe it's okay, I'm going to pump the brakes if he gets past like RB 27? Let's call it like that.
Let me take a look at who I have at RB 27.
Well, just in a general sense, it's sort of a steam question and not really like exact ranking question.
So listen, I don't want to create any more hype than what he's probably going to get.
Create it. We love it. Create the hype.
No, I know you love it, but
Dave Hubbard might. Dave, shout out to Dave Hubbard if you're listening on this one. This segment is dedicated to you.
Yeah. So, for me, the selfish side of me, obviously I got a draft, right? So there's not really a benefit to me to, really pump him up and hype him up.
Yeah.
I look at it as like for FTN subscribers, they've already been drafting him based on where I have him in my rankings. So they've already gotten plenty of shares of him and underdog and best ball drafts and things like that and any 350s. But I look at it as it's going to be difficult. I don't think there's anyone higher on Chase Brown than me, put it that way. So even before this news came out, I didn't even really, I was busy, so I didn't even pay attention to the report. I just, on my timeline, all I kept seeing was like, move him up your rankings. Might be time to reconsider and draft Chase Brown ahead of Zach Moss. And so I was like, what the heck? Where's this, coming from? I've already been on this street. So, I think where I have him in my rankings, I haven't moved him up based off of any positive news. I think where I have him was already aggressive.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the thing with Chase Brown is sort of and Nelson, the fantasy football omerta doesn't start until August 1st. You still can talk freely up until August 1st. And then we can kind of be a little more guarded. But I'll make a little more bullish case is the last time we saw Joe Burrow on an NFL field, for a full season, he targeted Joe Mixon and Samaje Perine like 125 times combined. That's not Zach Moss. So a guy like Chase Brown, even if Zach Moss is getting like a number of carries, Chase Brown's going to be the one catching passes. He's way more explosive. We sort of know what like a 26-year-old Zach Moss is. Chase Brown is super, super interesting to me. Let's talk about just one general rule. So you have a lot of rules when it comes to your fades list, but how about just a general rule in terms of concern level or whether it's something that even factors in for you? When you talk about holdouts or minor injuries, are these something that are these something that give you any concern? And I'll throw out a few player names here. Amari Cooper is holding out, CeeDee Lamb is holding out, and Chris Olave, by all accounts, is missing just like a few days, a week, nothing crazy. Does missing reps for a player that we've already seen have fantasy success bother you? or is it something that you completely ignore?
I do not worry about guys missing start of camp and missing practice time in the beginning. If they're, young guys, rookies trying to, get their share of targets or touches, it could possibly impact them. But I generally don't worry about it. What I worry about in terms of injuries is late in the preseason. So something that's going to travel into the regular season. So I would worry more about those than, any type of like little nicks or tweaks right now. And then in terms of holdout, like, CeeDee, I'm not moving him down. I'm not, changing him in my rankings because of a threat of a holdout. I typically do not get worried about something like that until like right before the season. If he's still holding out right before the season, then I get a little concerned, because not just because of him missing games, but just the simple fact that he's basically been out all of training camp and is not in football shape. So I do believe that that's a real thing. I think you can work out on the side and on your own privately as much as you want, but it's just different. In training camp and getting those reps, and then you're expected, like regular season. All right, he worked. The Cowboys cave, and they make him the highest paid wide receiver, and it's like, week 2 or whatever. I do think there is risk of him, picking up a hamstring, a calf injury, things like that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely interesting, and I completely agree with you on the football shape argument, where guys missing those last few reps, maybe you also get a little bit of slow out the gate. The team might not be comfortable giving a player a full snap share in their first game back if they've only been there for like a week. There's a lot of factors there that come into it. Week 1 matters, everyone. It doesn't matter as much as the money weeks, but it still matters. One other question before we get started with some of these league winners is injury discounts. Now, we talked about Olave. There's really nothing there by all accounts, but a guy like Jonathan Brooks, where we had some hope that he was going to be ahead of schedule, but now it's looking like he's a pup guy, torn ACL. Now it looks like, he'll maybe miss, I'm not sure how long, but it's not going to be a best case scenario. A guy like that, do you suddenly say, this is a guy where maybe I get an injury discount? I'm going to be more interested in drafting a player like that when he falls a round and a half? Or is that a player where you are more likely going to fade because you're a little bit more concerned? Or is it a question that you could answer both ways?
Well, I kind of expected him to miss time already. So where he was going, my opinion is that he's being overdrafted, because I do actually expect him to miss time going into the season. I think they're going to take it slow. I think he's a talented running back, but I do think they have depth there in Carolina, and it's not this thing where they're desperate to get him on the field. But that's not to say that once he does get on the field, he can't outperform the guys that are there. None of them are, anything special. But I felt like he was being overdrafted. In order for me to take him, I think the market needs to overcorrect itself, because I did think, he was going too high. If he goes at more of a discount, I might, I'll be open to it, because then I feel like, okay, I'm getting that discount on that guy, and I'm just I'm looking at second half of the season. What can he do? It's very similar to Breece Hall, right? But I do think Breece Hall is more talented than Brooks. Yeah, but
100%.
It's very similar. Last year, Breece Hall, there was drafts where he was going in the 3rd round, and I'm not pulling the trigger in the 3rd round, so I faded him. And I felt like there was other players where he was going that were going to be much more impactful the whole year. And I felt like Breece Hall was going to be more of in a committee, and there definitely was going to be the possibility of him taking off in the second half. But to use him in the second half and, on a playoff caliber team, you got to get there first. And if you're taking Breece Hall in the third round, you got to hit on some other, picks in order to compensate for that, because at the start of the year, Breece Hall was not good.
Yeah.
So that's my opinion on Brooks. I think that he needs to go a little bit lower than what he is.
Yeah, and I think that, like Nelson said, having a plan could also just mean if you're going to draft him, even at the reduced cost, bite the bullet and take a Chuba Hubbard share. Like with Breece Hall, if we had to have sort of a contingent play, you have to be able to get through the first month of the season when you do any kind of fragile running back build, whether it's a zero RB build, whether it's taking on an injured player. You have to have a pathway to get points early. You're going to hit the waiver wire in season, but that's not going to be there for you for like weeks 1, weeks 2 necessarily. Definitely an interesting one. Now, we're going to look at some of these league winners, and we're specifically looking at rounds 3 through 10. And I think that a lot of podcasts this time of year spend a ton of time on who you should take in rounds 1, round 2, and that's very important. But there's so many great players in those rounds that I think that the majority of most fantasy managers' focus should be on these rounds. These are the rounds that continually provide league winners year in, year out. Nelson, we don't have to go back very far to find some examples. 2021, it was certainly at the wide receiver position. We had Jamar Chase. We had Deebo Samuel, both dominating, finishing as top 6 wide receivers. You were able to get them very, very late. Last year was, and also Cooper Kupp, of course, was like one of the greatest wide receiver seasons ever. You were able to get him behind Robert Woods in a lot of drafts in sort of this 3 through 10 round. He was settled in as like let's call him a late third rounder in NFFC drafts. Still one of the best steals ever. 2022, it was more running backs. You had Josh Jacobs, you had Ramondre Stevenson, Tony Pollard, and then you had some wide receivers like A.J. Brown, Jalen Waddle, Devonta Smith. Last year, it was the running backs. You had all the guys we talked about early in the show, Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, Rachaad White, Joe Mixon, all finish inside of the top 6 at the running back position. And then you had DJ Moore, Mike Evans, absolutely crushed their ADPs, finished as wide receiver 1s. So I think when we focus on these rounds, we're able to find guys that maybe the market is not pushing up enough, that maybe the market's fading their offense. All sorts of factors can lead to massive ADP wins. But let's go ahead and start with you. You have one guy that you included in your this year's Rachaad White, and that's James Cook. Why don't you talk about your enthusiasm for him?
Yeah, so I think that, for starters, just from a talent standpoint, I think that he's very talented. He's fast, can catch the ball out of the backfield. And I like the fact that once they made the coaching change at offensive coordinator, you saw a heavy emphasis on running the ball and getting the running backs more involved out of the backfield. And he had his biggest, touch games was after that point. Once there was a new offensive coordinator, he got some heavy workloads down the stretch. So that's kind of what I'm predicting, is that that's going to continue. And I think with Diggs gone, I think that only helps his cause, that, Allen will look to try to use him more out of the backfield because, he is a playmaker and he can make guys miss. I think for him to realize like his true breakout, he's going to have to fall in the end zone a few more times, whether it's, outside the 20 or they, potentially, use him inside the red zone. But even if they don't, I still think that there's plenty of room for him to be, top 5 running back. So that's my prediction.
Yeah, and I love it. And I've talked to you about the Buffalo Bills offense And after you wrote this article, we talked a little bit more about James Cook, and I think a lot of people are very concerned about the lack of opportunities inside the 5-yard line. But like Nelson said, I'm not really, because the guy had 230 carries last year. That's not even counting what we're going to see with him as a receiver. And he only had 2 rushing scores last year on 230 carries. I think if he gets that sort of 200 plus carry total with an offense that we believe is going to be a very productive one, that touchdown total is going to go up, whether he's getting them inside the 5-yard line or not. And definitely a top-notch offense that scored points every single season for us in terms of fantasy managers. And for me, I'll stay in Buffalo. And one guy that I see as a massive value for us, especially with NFFC ADP. A lot of people here play FFPC, and Kincaid you're having to take in the second. But in NFFC, I'm able to get Dalton Kincaid as a late 5th-round pick. And I think he has an opportunity to have a Travis Kelce-like target total where he leads Buffalo in targets. He's getting like 135, 140 targets. And I think his floor for targets is probably 125, 100 in this offense. Kincaid took a massive step forward last year, had a number of strong weeks, tailed off a bit at the end, but he really flashed for what he could be. They lose Stephon Diggs. They lose Gabe Davis. They need somebody to step up as a touchdown scorer as well that can thrive in the red zone. So for me, Dalton Kincaid is one I'm very much into. Nelson, anything to add on Kincaid?
No, I was a big fan of his, last year. And I think that in his second year, I would expect him to build off of his rookie year. Again, just looking at the simple equation of, you subtract Diggs from that offense and you have a talented kid at tight end, I would just expect those targets to go up. So yeah, I like him this year.
And another guy that I think a lot of people were on last year, you're interested in this year, and that's Christian Watson. Talk about your enthusiasm for Watson.
Yeah, so I've always been enamored with him. He's the type.
And I'll give you a shout out. The day before, this is 2 years back, in Christian Watson's rookie year, Nelson started him on a whim. Like, not a whim. You were recommending him to everybody as a guy that you think was going to be get his big breakout. You didn't necessarily think it was going to be like 30 points. But Christian Watson had his massive coming out party game, and you started him on a number of lineups. So still a hat tip to you on that one, Nelson.
Yeah, no, I remember our conversation. I remember the text from you, giving me props for making that call. Because at that point, he had been injured or whatever, and we hadn't seen anything out of him. So it was like, how are you going to trust him, put him in your freaking lineup?
It was Dallas, right? It was versus the Cowboys, I think on like a primetime game where he went nuts.
Like 3 touchdowns, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so
with him, I feel like if he can get his hamstring issue under control, he has that persona, that vibe of what I'm looking for, of like that, he's just like a difference maker. So like he can win you weeks by himself. And I think in that offense, like it's going to come down to like, his injuries at the end of the day. Like obviously he's got an issue with like staying healthy with his hammies, but everything I've heard is that it's, under control, and he spent some time really focused on analyzing what was causing all these, hamstring injuries. And if he's on the field, like he's going to put up points. Like he's shown that he's not this like decoy or, a guy with, that's just going to run empty routes. So I think he's another guy that probably sticks out to me that could be a bust, could get re-injured and it's like, whatever, unbelievable, burnt me again, type thing. Or you could be sitting here, middle of the season, you're like, oh man, like what a difference maker this guy is based on where he went in drafts.
Yeah, and he's a guy that I had on my post-type sleepers article that just dropped at playerprofiler.com talking about a guy, Nelson, that this time last year we were drafting in like the 3rd round, and now we're able to get him in like the 7th round. So definitely an interesting one. And for me, my next guy that I think could win leagues is going to cost you a lot more. And there's a chance that I'm off on this one. I don't think this is a lock. It's going to take a little bit to do with the offense being able to be solid, not great, but not like bottom 5 in the league type. And that's Malik Neighbors. I think Malik Neighbors is an exceptional talent. You're able to get this guy in the 3rd round, and I think his target ceiling is like 150. And this is a player that I believe is by far and away the best offensive skill position player on his team, let alone the wide receiver room. New York hasn't had a wide receiver since Odell Beckham hit 70 receptions, hit 1,000 yards. And I think Malik Neighbors is going to blow those numbers out of the water. It cost you a 3rd round pick, but we've seen rookie wide receivers finish top 6 in PPR scoring 3 out of the last 4 years. I think Neighbors checks a lot of boxes for me. I want to have more exposure to Neighbors. I wish I could pay a 4th rounder for him, Nelson, but I'm still going to take some shots in the 3rd.
Yeah, so I like Neighbors a lot and super talented. That's not the question. The question mark is the offense and Daniel Jones, right? And that is my main concern that could keep him from realizing his potential. And not just realizing his potential, like there could be a problem. Like if they don't fix their offensive line issues from last year, it's going to be a struggle for him to get those 150 targets.
Yeah, they said in NFL they were 2nd worst all time in terms of sacks given up. If you want to like that's insane. And there was only one other team in NFL history that let up as many sacks. But I would kind of push back that I think getting the ball to Neighbors around the line of scrimmage on like manufactured looks, quick looks, quick slants, you maybe run some smoke for him, some screens. He's going to be one that's going to actually help alleviate a little bit of the pass rush with just how dynamic he is around the line of scrimmage. Just a counterpoint.
No, listen, I know you're bullish on him. I have a little bit of pause where, in normal circumstances, I would be overweight on him on this type of talent, but it is a 3rd round pick. And again, I'm not convinced just yet that the offensive line it has been fixed, because it was borderline comical. Watching them last year, it was just like every drop back. I was kind of chuckling because I was like, you can't possibly be this bad. But they were. So that worries me. I think that Dable hasn't lost his touch in terms of being a creative and talented play caller. I expect him. I think he's on the hot seat. So I expect him to take control of the play calling. I don't think Kafka is going to be the guy. At least, for me, if I'm in Dable's shoes, I'm taking control and trying to make this offense work. So, and then Daniel Jones, at the end of the day, Daniel Jones concerns me because, we've seen flashes from him and like you see like the talent, right? You see glimpses, but he's just hasn't been consistent at all throughout his career.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of question marks. And I would argue that if Neighbors would have had a potentially better quarterback situation, he'd be drafted a little bit higher. As crazy as it is, we see where Marvin Harrison Jr. is being drafted. Malik Neighbors is closer to him in talent. And there's a lot of people that we respect that actually think Neighbors is a better player. So for me, I think we get a little bit of a discount by how ugly the offense is. Clear wide receiver 1 in the offense. I want to keep this going. I'm actually going to throw out one more, Nelson, because you have a double team one. So we'll let you kind of like keep them together.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say right now, DeAndre Hopkins is one that interests me a ton where he's going. We're talking about a player that you're getting a discount because the age, you're getting a discount because there's a Calvin Ridley in town. You're getting a discount because a lot of people don't believe in Will Levis. But for me, in a 3 wide receiver start format like the NFFC, where you can get a guy like DeAndre Hopkins now around pick 80, pick 75 to pick 80, that's a guy who could beat that very easily. And I think he gets me off to a very quick start this year when I get him in that range. Now, certainly we have concerns about a player that old breaking down throughout the year. But if Tennessee is going to take this massive step forward in terms of pass volume, and I can get DeAndre Hopkins at that level, I'm interested. I think Hopkins looked good last year, and people are just sort of forgetting about him in drafts. And to me, I'm going to take that discount every single time, despite the age. And if I'm wrong, I'm still only using like a pretty late pick, nothing that's going to completely burn me.
Yeah, I really don't have anything to add because of where he is going in drafts. I think like the worst case scenario is like he just breaks down and gets injured. But if he doesn't, he's gonna perform up to his ADP. Like he'll reach his value just because of how talented he is and who he is. He's not going to be like phased out of the offense on account of Calvin Ridley. So
yeah,
he's going to be involved week to week.
And also the one other factor is D-Hops has been around Will Levis before. And I think the market sort of thinking Calvin Ridley is going to step in and just be sort of the alpha. I know Callahan's talked about him in the Jamar Chase role, but will these guys like D-Hops, who's like a football addict, who has familiarity with the quarterback there, he's the voice in the locker room that probably gets respected the most. Of course, we're not in the Tennessee locker room, but you're talking about a Hall of Famer who's healthy, ready to go. The veteran deference for me, if I'm Will Levis, like that's the guy for me to take that next step forward as a pro. If I am taking a big step forward in the passing game, I'm going to look to DeAndre Hopkins, intermediate routes. They're a mess at tight end right now too, Nelson. We think it's going to be pretty consolidated. So to keep this going, you have another Tennessee Titan or plural as guys you think could be major impacts on fantasy success this year.
Yeah, I guess we're pretty bullish on the Titans taking that next step, because if we're naming all these guys from this offense, something's got to give, because we're either going to be, severely wrong if Levis is not the real deal and doesn't take the next step forward. But if they do, then there's a lot of players in this offense that you're going to want a piece of. And when I look at it, it's Pollard and Spears, right? So I believe that going into the season, it's going to be a committee, okay? And I actually think that they have standalone value, that if the offense does take the next step, I think both guys have the potential to be startable on your team as like an RB2, okay? And when I look at it, I think that I'm going to want my fair share of both players, because if we don't wish injury on anybody, but if it happens to one of these guys, the other running back, I think, has the talent with a full workload to be a top 5 running back, especially in this offense, because I have Tennessee as one of the highest rated offensive lines this year in the NFL. So I think they're going to be running behind a very talented offensive line. And again, if Levis, takes the next step, I think it's a talented play caller. It's a huge upgrade from what they had, before. So I think you're going to want a piece of these guys on, different teams, because if there is an injury, the other guy is going to be really good.
Yeah, and I think you nailed that one where, like, even if there's no injury, I think these guys are going to give you, especially in a lot of your hero RB teams, consistent RB2 starts. But neither one of them is a huge back by any means. These guys are more high value touch guys. And I think Tennessee's telling you exactly what they want to do with the Callahan hire, with the Ridley signing, with the Pollard signing, and the fact that they're going into the season with Pollard and Spears as their running backs, 2 guys who both went over 50 receptions last year. I love how you bring up the contingent upside for these 2 guys, because it might not even be like a one guy misses the season type argument you're making. you could give a 5-game stretch where Tyjae Spears is your starting is the unquestioned high guy without Pollard or vice versa, and those 5 weeks could be a major driver for you in competitive fantasy football leagues. I love that argument, and the sort of like we're bullish on Tennessee, Nelson, but we don't have to pay any prices. Like we're talking about like cheap values. We're paying RB3 and wide receiver 3 prices to get a D-Hops and Pollard and Spears. And hey, if you're a Calvin Ridley person and you're listening and saying, hey, these guys are wrong, Ridley's going to be the main beneficiary, even he is not steamed up to a point. So no one on Tennessee is that expensive. We're so used to bad Tennessee offenses, but you still have to take Derrick Henry in like the first round. Yeah. Now you have a potentially better offense where everybody's cheap. That's the kind of offense that we can sometimes find exceptional ADP value in. And I'll close it out. Our 8th guy that I'm going to talk about here, and much like Malik Neighbors, this is not a cheap player in ADP. It's George Pickens. And George Pickens, you're having something rare where it's the offensive coordinator discount. If Zach Robinson, who signed with Atlanta, was named offensive coordinator in Pittsburgh, George Pickens' ADP would be 15 spots higher. I'm pretty safe saying that. I think he would be looked at as like not quite where Drake London's going, but he would be going a lot higher than this. Mike Tomlin's had a long history of wide receiver 1 success. I don't think Arthur Smith is going to be able to do like to George Pickens target wise what we saw a guy like he was able to do to AJ Brown in Tennessee, or Drake London for that matter. I think that based on the other wide receivers on Pittsburgh's roster, George Pickens is going to have to be utilized. I think that you're talking about a guy who, if we can just get him to 125 targets, Nelson, I think he could really beat his ADP. But if there's a scenario where George Pickens becomes an even larger part of the offense and we sort of break through that Arthur Smith hurdle and we get him up to like 135, he led the NFL in yards per reception last year, went over 1,100 yards. He's a dog. He's an alpha. And it's a guy who's 23 years old. He's younger than some of the rookies in this rookie class. And you talk about his rookie year in Pittsburgh was coming off of a catastrophic injury at Georgia. So you have a fully healthy player who had success in year 2. This could be a huge year 3. His numbers could end up looking like Nico Collins's did to end last year, like low-end wide receiver 1 level player.
Listen, I love the player. Again, my worry is it's not the player itself. It's the fact of the offensive coordinator.
Oh, yeah.
And I dislike.
He's a villain.
Arthur
He's
Smith.
a bad guy. He's a bad guy. Arthur Smith's a bad dude.
He's a bad guy. He's a bad dude.
But Nelson,
I put him up there with like your local drug dealer on the corner. Like
yeah.
he's on top of the list of bad guys.
He's detrimental to your community. And I'll say this, but one thing that we have going for us is this is Mike Tomlin. He is the voice in the room. This isn't like a situation where it's a younger head coach where the offensive coordinator is just going to hand the keys and say, go do whatever you want. You have one of the most commanding head coaches in the league. I would argue with Bill Belichick and Pete Carroll gone, Mike Tomlin is sort of the elder statesman. Harbaugh in Baltimore as well could go in that mix. But like those two guys are like the voices in the NFL when it comes to head coaches who have been in battles throughout the year. They have control of the locker room. It's the unquestioned voice of the organization. And I think at the end of the day, Arthur Smith is going to Arthur Smith's being brought in to improve the offense. Obviously, Matt Canada had issues there as well. But this is a potentially division that might be a little more shootout friendly than in previous years, with Todd Monken in Baltimore, Cleveland making the change at OC, Cincinnati's going to have to be pass heavy. I think it's sort of I look at this roster, George Pickens is going to have to be a massive part of it if Pittsburgh is going to challenge for this division. And Mike Tomlin's voice matters to me as much as Arthur Smith's. Mm-hmm. And George Pickens is just sitting there at a range where if he just does what he did last year in terms of the final stats, he's not killing you at this range. But if he takes a step forward, then he could end up being a guy who has a big say in win rates this year in fantasy football.
No, listen, I agree. He's got huge upside because I do believe in the talent, but I do think that he's a little bit of a knucklehead. himself. So I can envision two like very different scenarios. I can picture him just being the alpha, getting all the targets, and just putting up a monster season. And then next year we're drafting him in the first round. I could see that. I could also see Arthur Smith throwing the ball to Patterson or getting him involved, and like Pickens goes like 2 games in a row with like 3 targets, okay? And him just punching Arthur Smith in the face and being like suspended the rest of the year.
Well, listen, if you're going to go out punching Arthur Smith. I think we'd be all for that one. Nelson, this was awesome. We're going to have to do it again sometime soon. Again, the guys we talked about as these league winners, James Cook, Malik Neighbors, George Pickens, Christian Watson, Dalton Kincaid, DeAndre Hopkins, and the Tennessee running backs. Nelson, let everybody know once again where they can find your work.
FTN Fantasy, click on the high stakes package. It's $199. I would say it's not cheap, but I'm biased and I think that it's a value for what you get. Take a look at it. My DMs are open if you have questions and you're thinking about, jumping in and joining. There's a lot of good information that we put out.
100%. Highly recommend Nelson's work. Nelson, we're going to crush it this year on Teams We Split, and you're going to crush it if you stick with press coverage. Check out my previous episode with 32 beat writers. Really strong stuff from those guys, and definitely highly recommend Nelson's work. Check us out next week. We'll be back with brand new press coverages. We're going to rock 1 or 2 of these right up until opening kickoff. We'll see you soon.